The uh, the book that is for sale is called War is a Lie, and it's meant to be a handbook to prepare people to recognize war lies when they see them, so that they don't have to wait decades for papers to come out and Freedom of Information Act requests to be answered and to find out that a war was based on lies, that we recognize them when we see them. And so it looks at types of lies. Lies that wars are defensive, for example. Wars like the vicious aggression against Iraq in 2003 are sold as defensive. It looks at wars that are marketed as humanitarian, which is a relatively new way, but almost universally applied to all wars now, that they are in some way humanitarian. So you pretend that Gaddafi is threatening to massacre civilians, which he wasn't. You get a UN authorization to protect them. You go in and bomb the capital and overthrow the government and create disaster and proliferate weapons around the region, and very quickly forget about the so-called humanitarian mission of protecting the civilians, because you've moved on to the follow-through of punishing the wrongdoer who was going to massacre the civilians. And so there actually has not yet been a humanitarian war that benefited humanity, but there is this relatively new marketing scheme for wars. In the book, I look at numerous types of lies that are used to start wars, continue wars, make wars seem better after the fact, escalate wars, and I look more than at any other war at the wars that people tend to say are the good ones, and of course World War II more than any other. And if you want, we can talk about all the reasons that World War II was not a good war. But the U.S. government understands more than history teachers, I think, the value of maintaining the lies and inventing new lies about long past wars. So President Obama is the first president who has declared the war in Korea a success. You know, after decades of it being a futile, stupid draw, they have the Pentagon has a multi-million-dollar program now to tell lies and exaggerations and beautify the war in Vietnam. And Veterans for Peace is doing a wonderful job of countering some of that, and they've got a paper out on the table here. They're building a World War I monument in Washington, D.C. Of all the stupid wars you can make monuments to. And so then in the book I also look at actual motives, right? So if the wars weren't really to defeat ultimate evil and defend ourselves and protect the civilians and enforce the rule of law and be the global policeman and support the troops. You know, once the war is going, it's for the benefit of the soldiers sent to it to support the troops and continue the war, which, by the way, has not shown up once in a single private email from Hillary Clinton. It's, you know, shows up only in public justifications for wars. There are, you know, beyond all those claims of what the wars are for, there are actual motivations of what wars are for, some rational, some less so, including profits, including geopolitics, including domination and revenge and punitiveness and so forth. And so I look at these types of common motivations that actually seem to justify wars. And we've seen this put to the test in recent years since I wrote the first edition of this book. In 2013, as revealed by Seymour Hersh later, President Obama had committed himself to a massive bombing campaign of Syria and had promised John McCain and other senators on the Hill that this was going to happen. Northrop Grumman understood it was going to happen and was making more missiles as fast as it could, and its profits were through the roof, record high. Every media outlet, the leadership of both of the big political parties, said these missiles are going to hit Syria. And there was a serious push in the media by President Obama and Secretary Kerry, with the president saying, go look at YouTubes on your computer of children being poisoned by chemical weapons in Syria. And we know for a fact, we won't show you the evidence, but we know for a fact that Bashar al-Assad did this. And of course, they didn't have any evidence, and they still don't, and we don't know who did it. But we do know that it was in the middle of a war in which men, women, and children were being killed by all sides with all kinds of weapons. And the idea that this one particular type of weapon was a reason for a major escalation in the war was a little too close to Iraq 2003. And the threat to Syrians wasn't quite the same as a threat to Americans, which is really what generates support for wars among Americans. And so you had Jewish holidays, AIPAC out of town, you had Congress members on leave and speaking at town hall events like this one and being questioned, why should we get in a war on the side of Al-Qaeda? And you had the House of Commons, moved by the British public, say no to a prime minister on war for the first time since Yorktown. And you had enough public pressure build up, more phone calls, more emails, more visits than anything ever, banker bailouts, wars, peace, anything. But fundamentally, it was a question of the previous 10 years of having made Iraq a badge of shame, and Hillary Clinton having been unable to win a primary, having voted for that war. Why she hasn't lost this one yet, I don't know. But the movement that drove so many countries to oppose the war in Iraq and made it illegal at the UN and allowed us to protest it as a criminal enterprise rather than a humanitarian movement for the previous decade made Congress members say, I don't want to be that jerk who votes for another Iraq. And Obama, as he admitted in the article in The Atlantic recently, reversed his decision and shocked all of his staff and so forth, which is the last thing they ever want to admit, that we had any sort of impact, which we do all the time, but they don't want to admit it. And a year later, the public having stood up against war lies and said, no, we don't want this, and the Congress and the administration having gone ahead with arming proxies and training forces and moved very, very little on any major actual aid campaign or diplomacy or ceasefire or disarmament agreement, everything having worsened. And President Obama having asked the CIA for a report, has arming proxies ever worked? And they having said, well, no, and except for that time in Afghanistan, but there was a little bit of blowback. And President Obama having said, okay, and gone ahead with arming proxies in Syria, and everything having gotten worse, the people who probably would have been put in charge of Syria had that bombing campaign happened, which Hillary Clinton to this day says it should have, and Obama was wrong to call it off, in other words, ISIS, put out these videos of white people and knives, and everybody lost their minds. And now the president wanted to get in the war on the opposite side from what you had a moral responsibility to get in the war on the previous year, plus the same side too. We're going to get in on both sides, actually. And it made no sense whatsoever. And everybody said, oh, okay, because of the power of fear. And now you have the State Department last week, or maybe it's a week and a half ago now, a State Department spokesman, you can go watch the video, being asked by a reporter, do you want Syria to retake the town of Palmyra, or do you want ISIS to hold on to it? And the guy refusing to answer, and ultimately saying, I don't want ISIS to be weakened in any way if it strengthens Syria. Because the priority among the enemy list for the U.S. government remains the Syrian government, which they have managed to scare about 3 Americans of. The priority among the American public that's got them so scared they can barely think is ISIS. Right? And so you have to, everybody imagines the government has the same priorities, but their priority is very different. And so they've been arming Al-Qaeda in Syria for years now. Intentionally and knowingly and directly and indirectly. And the public, has no idea. You now have forces armed by the CIA in Syria fighting forces armed by the Pentagon in Syria. Right? I mean, this isn't just Yemen or Libya or Afghanistan or any of the endless wars where you have U.S. weapons on both sides. You have U.S. trained and armed people on both sides. Right? I mean, it's absolute madness. Now, Hillary Clinton wants a no-fly zone because someday ISIS might develop the airplane, but but the government but the government is now talking about giving their fighters on the ground in Syria anti-aircraft weaponry. And I was just talking with someone who lives near Boeing out here about all the talk about all the planes, the U.S. planes that need to go over to Syria. Does anybody remember what George W. Bush said to Tony Blair on January 31st, 2003, right before they held a press conference about how they were trying to avoid war in Iraq? One of his schemes for how they could start a war in Iraq? He said, let's paint some planes with UN colors and fly them low and see if we can get them shot at. Right? So why give anti-aircraft weaponry to people on the ground in Syria? And what happens when they do shoot down an airplane? So work to be done in that theater, if I may use the term. In Iran, the peace movement has been stopping an attack on Iran for so many years that we now have a very strong argument that says every time they bring up we need to urgently attack Iran, why, when you've been saying that for years and we haven't done it yet? Can't we wait a few more years? Because we stopped it in 2007, we stopped it in 2015 against all the lobbying efforts of billionaires and AIPAC and the demand for war, but stopped it in a possibly Pyrrhic victory because both sides, were telling the U.S. public the Iranians are trying to build nuclear weapons and they want to kill us. Therefore, one side said, we must attack them, or therefore the other side said we must establish this agreement and have good inspections and so forth. But both sides lying, and the public left in a worse place than before, except for the fact that the war has been held off for yet another year. And the longer it's held off, the more the claims of urgency, which is one of the standard lies with every war. It's urgent. Because if you don't do it urgently, somebody might think of something else you might do. If you have to attack Iraq because if you give the inspectors another week, they might swear there are no weapons. The urgency doesn't hold up with Iran because we keep stopping it. I've done a lot of these events now the past week or two, and I asked this question last night in Bellingham, and nobody could do it. I bet somebody here can do it. Raise your hand if you can name the 7 nations that our current president has bragged about bombing. Right here, front row. Perfect. I can see you.
Yeah, Yemen is one of them. Somalia is one of them. Libya is one of them. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Yeah, did I count 7 now or not?
6. That was very. That
was part of Pakistan.
You got it. The United States is the only country on earth that cannot keep track of its wars. The only country. It's unheard of. The Roman Empire could keep track of its wars. The United States is the only country on earth where a presidential candidate is asked, are you willing to kill innocent children by the thousands to be commander-in-chief, as if that's the responsibility of being commander-in-chief. The interesting thing about that last one, Pakistan, there's a man from Pakistan who they have tried to kill, the White House has tried to kill with missile strikes from drones 4 times and failed. And he's now gone to London to ask if he can be taken off the lists. And then he's going to go back to Pakistan, and then they're going to keep trying to kill him. And President Obama says that he will only kill people if they can't possibly be arrested. We don't know of a single case in reality where that's been true. We know of many where it's demonstrably false. Where they have been identified and we know who they are. Not true of most drone victims. Where they are an imminent threat to the United States. Not true of an imminent and continuing threat, which doesn't even exist in logic, but to the United States. But not a single case, of course, in reality. And everything that people think about drones is a pack of lies. And when people come up to you, as they have to me, and say, I prefer drones because with drones nobody gets killed, they, they are erasing 96% of humanity from the earth, which is, a significant way in which we're lied to about wars. Who counts? Who counts as a nobody? The the interesting thing about Yemen, which I think you named early on there, is that when Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was deciding to waive all the restrictions on selling the airplanes to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, with which to bomb Yemen, and as they are now doing, bombing Yemen with U.S. weapons and the active support of the U.S. military, a company called Boeing gave $900,000 to a foundation called the Clinton Family Foundation. And Boeing needs to be shamed for that. Saudi Arabia, as it happened, had already given the Clinton Family Foundation over $10 million. Hillary Clinton and the Saudi royalty need to be shamed about that. But this is the level of corruption that we're up against in trying to stop wars, and we still are able to do it. But when you hear people talk about a company like Boeing, they talk about it as a jobs program, and we wouldn't want to eliminate jobs. We wouldn't want, Madam Senator, we wouldn't want you to lose those jobs, would we? This is how it's talked about in public. I mean, which sounds sociopathic if you're living among that other 96% of humanity, that you would kill people for jobs. And it doesn't even make economic sense because you can convert to peaceful jobs and benefit economically. So we have layer upon layer of corruption, on top of which we have all of the lies that support this empire. You watch the Super Bowl and they thank the troops for watching from 175 countries, and nobody blinks, and nobody goes and looks at which countries are still missing from the list, and they're the ones that are the evil threats to stability and peace in the world. They're Iran and Syria, and our Veterans for Peace hero, Smedley Butler, said that the United States military should stay within 200 miles of the United States, which would work wonders and cut 90% of military spending. Our current Secretary of so-called Defense, they don't call it war anymore, is on his way to go take a little cruise on an aircraft carrier in the China Sea, where China and the United States / Philippines are disputing a bunch of rocks in the water, and where Chinese island construction and Chinese ship sailing in the China Sea, which is named that for a reason, is considered a threat to the United States and an act of aggression by China. It's madness. It's madness that's out in the open. That's not secret anymore. And assassinations are not secret anymore. It's a drone program that the president signs off on every Tuesday. So it's very important for us to recognize what's happening with current wars. It's also just as important for us to tear down the myths about the past wars, about the idea that we needed a revolution, that somehow we're better off than Canada, which hasn't had it yet, that you couldn't end slavery without a war, even though other countries ended slavery without a war, that the Civil War that the Revolution wasn't about westward empire, that the Civil War wasn't about westward empire. The North and the South could have agreed. If they hadn't both agreed, they were expanding and disagreed about what was going to be slave and free in the new land. Every war has been based on a pile of lies. I heard many people treat the Iraq War in 2003 as somehow unique. And the Spanish-American War was based on lies. Spain wanted to go to arbitration and prove they had nothing to do with blowing up the ship in Cuba, and the United States wanted a war. President Wilson and President Roosevelt told the lies about U.S. ships being innocently attacked by Germany when they were ships that were helping British airplanes, when the United States went out of its way to provoke Japan, when Jewish refugees were turned away and ships within sight of Miami were chased off by the Coast Guard. A war that, in World War II, that had nothing to do with saving the Jews or other victims of the camps until after the war was over, except for peace activists who were trying to get those people out of there and to end the war before more were killed. And a war which killed 50 or to 70 million people, not just 9 million people in camps. John Kerry was just over in Hiroshima, not to apologize, but to maintain the pretense that there was some justification for dropping nuclear bombs on cities. When there wasn't. There's no dispute. There wasn't, and they knew it. And now the United States is building what they call smaller, more usable nuclear weapons. And the other 8 nuclear countries are all building new nuclear weapons. And there is a growing movement to ban nuclear weapons. And there's legislation I just saw today in the Netherlands to ban the nuclear weapons from and get them out of that country, which Scotland was about to do if it got independence. There is a movement going in both directions on nuclear weapons, and it matters very much who wins. There is also a growing movement to end all war. And this is what I've been working on with a project called World Beyond War. There's a clipboard that Dan has that if he can pass around, if you're so inclined to sign, it's a very short statement at the top that has been signed by people in 133 countries and growing that says, I want to help end all wars. We've got a video I'm going to put out next week from Archbishop Desmond Tutu explaining his support for this and promoting a conference that we're planning in September. But this is a movement that is growing worldwide that is, seeking to put an end to the idea that we need to distinguish the bad wars from the good wars, any more than we distinguish bad rape from good rape or bad child abuse from good child abuse, that war is always bad. And to tear down the arguments that are, much more prominent in this country than in most places, that war is inevitable and natural. The fact is that at least 90% of people on Earth are represented by governments that put radically less into wars and militarism than this one, in many cases nothing. 99% of people in the United States and more have nothing to do with participating in wars and want nothing to, 44%, I think, in a poll of Americans said they would participate in a war. Well, what's stopping them? We got more wars than we can count. They don't actually they want to think of themselves as participating in wars. There is not yet a single case of post-traumatic stress disorder from war deprivation. There is the top killer of U.S. troops is suicide after they come home. Right? The idea that there's something natural or inevitable about this is just sheer madness. So we've created this organization to try to nudge the peace movement in the direction of talking about ending particular wars as models for ending all wars, and stop saying things like, let's end this war so we're more prepared for better wars, or let's stop the wasteful weapons that don't work. I love the wasteful weapons that don't work. I want to stop the efficient weapons that kill. Let's talk about it as abolition of war and not as, just opposition to particular little bits. And let's make it global. And let's work with other countries. The people in Okinawa who have just stopped a base for the moment, let's support them. Let's go after Ambassador Kennedy and President Obama and make that stick and close the other bases there too. And let's build a bigger coalition. The top destroyer of the natural environment is something that the biggest environmental groups will not touch. The top consumer of petroleum on Earth is the United States military. It would rank number 30-something in a list of nations if it were a nation. It is the 3rd biggest polluter of U.S. waterways. It is the top creator of Superfund disaster sites. It is, about an hour of a military jet is equivalent to you driving your car around all year. I mean, this is the scale of the destruction of the natural environment. Never mind the landmines and the depleted uranium and the burn pits and the white phosphorus, and the nation of Iraq that has been destroyed permanently will never recover. This is an environmental issue. And the money that is desperately needed to protect the environment is all being dumped into war, unless we were going to start taxing billionaires and corporations. So it's the civil liberties groups that go after torture and assassination and so forth, but not the military spending that creates it. So it's also a question of the dollars. I mean, the top way that war kills is not any weapon, but it's by moving the dollars. Tens of billions could end starvation, clean drinking water, green energy, infrastructure, education, in this country and abroad. $1 trillion a year just from the United States on this criminal enterprise. I encourage you to go to worldbeyondwar.org. Probably next week or soon we will have information about a big conference we're going to have in September on alternatives to war in Washington, D.C., but we're going to be giving people the tools to do similar events everywhere else. One of the many, many speakers already lined up for that is former Congressman Kucinich. So we will be looking forward to seeing him. And I would love to answer as many questions as I can, and thank you very, very much for coming out.
Frankly, I feel that war has become a part of the American culture. Like, I can't imagine actually the American culture itself without a war now. You go to any arcade, in any movie theater or shopping mall, and you find kids enjoying shooting and killing, which is exactly what the kids operating the drones are doing.
I agree. You know, in terms of the U.S. culture being completely overwhelmed with devotion to war, and war having been completely normalized so that everyone accepts it as is for the most part nothing new. And the U.S. Revolution was a revolution to take the war west and kill the natives of this land, as was the Civil War. And once the land was conquered, there goes Hawaii and Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and on and on. War has been part of U.S. culture since before there was a United States. I actually can imagine, you know, it doesn't take anything but a feat of imagination to imagine something. I can imagine a United States without the war making. I know many people in the United States who do everything they possibly can, including going to prison, to end the war making. It's good to understand what we're up against, and that takes years of study. But to imagine a different world just takes kindergarten. You know, I mean, my kids can imagine a world without war. And I think we have to, you know, before women got the vote, you could say, you know, you could stand up and say women have never voted. I can't imagine a world in which women could vote. And by the way, they didn't vote themselves the right to vote. And the idea that you change anything by voting, you know, I will quote a nice woman activist, Emma Goldman, who said if voting ever changed anything, they would ban it. What changes things is precisely what this gentleman said, is changing the culture. Changing the culture so that it's acceptable to oppose war, so that big environmental groups that know that the military is the #1 opponent of a healthy environment are willing to go against the flags and the music and the troops and oppose war, so that the 90% of corporations that would actually benefit from peace are willing to publicly say, as some of them have been moved to be willing to publicly say they're for gay rights, or they're for net neutrality, or they're for other things. We have to change the culture, and that takes activism and education and agitation and all the 1,001 tools of nonviolence. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's what we have to do.
That's all the time we have. The speaker will be signing books right behind me, and please join me in thanking the speaker.
Be open.